Nothing beats playing fantasy esports, and there's no complexity in deciding where you would want to play Alpha Draft. Maybe you can finally be cut loose to have some fun, play your role of being a winner in the contests that they have for CSGO. Assume the mantle of the team leader, select your side, deciding who to put out into the field. Alpha Draft, Skrilla, Fantasy Esports. I pretty much lost the plot of that last one there. They can't all be knockouts, can't all be 10 out of 10s, boys. So, n0thing, Jordan Gilbert, is the last of the original complexity CSGO core left. And so it means that from this point onwards, his legacy is entirely his own to shape in terms of now he can shape one that's different and separate from all the players that he really built his name in CSGO with. So the original complexity lineup in CSGO, the one that's relevant, it was Hiko, who at the time was the best player, the best North American player, in fact. Semphis, who'd been with Hiko in Quantic, who had been the best North American team. n0thing, as we've just mentioned, who hadn't been in Quantic. Eskers, who'd very briefly been in the Quantic lineup, but before they were known as Quantic, when they were Area 51. And Swag, who also hadn't been in Quantic. So this was the original lineup. This is the lineup you may remember that went and got top 4 at the major. DreamHack Winter 2013, the first ever major. It was still the highest placing by any North American team to date. That core, in general, obviously some players went and left, was the only team from North America to ever make the round of 8 of a major, and obviously would make 2 additional ones, Katowice and then ESL 1 Cologne. And since then, no North American team has ever made the round of 8 of a major. Now, what happened was, in 2014, a little bit after ESL 1 Katowice, actually EMS 1 Katowice in March of 2014, Swag left quite inexplicably to go and join iBuyPower, the rivals who'd actually bombed the major but had won ESEA earlier in the year, beating Titan. And so this team got in Anger initially, who'd been removed from iBuyPower, and then later on they got in Shroud and they became Cloud9. So the team was down to 4 of the original members at that point in time. They kept those 4 for quite a long time. They managed to place top 8 at the next major, almost got to the semis, had that amazing game versus NIP that was decided on Cobblestone. Late in the year, they had some problems, though, and Hiko left prior to... let me think, maybe it wasn't actually. Hiko left the team, and his reason he left was he was going to go and make a super team. He was essentially going to join iBuyPower, and they would be the NA super team. So the team was down to 3 then. So they brought in Shazam to replace Hiko. And the reason for bringing in Shazam is he'd had this phenomenal tournament with Denial at ESEA Season 17, including bodying Cloud9. So they brought in Shazam, hoping he'd be this AWPer, bringing some firepower. Didn't really work out. In fact, they had a terrible major. They kicked out Shazam and Semphis. Semphis is gone. Now they were down to 2 final members. Brought in Skadoodle and Freakazoid. That left 2 remaining members of the core. They stayed together for basically nearly all of 2015, and in late 2015, Sean Gares finally left, and now we were down to 1, and n0thing is the last remaining member. So one of the things about n0thing's role within complexity at Cloud9 over the years is there have been some problems over the years, in fact at most periods of time. So in the early days of this lineup, when they'd come from 2 of the members, Semphis and Hiko, being in Quantic, which is a team that also had Dazed, TCK, Frost, was quite a balanced team and had done pretty well at a few international tournaments and shown the ability to win maps and potentially series off top European teams. You came into this lineup with Cole and they lacked a little bit for firepower, because with n0thing, because of the fact he'd been one of the best NA players in 1.6, it was expected, or they were hoping, that he could be kind of a star player or a second star within the team to go along with Hiko, who at the time was the best NA player. Unfortunately, he couldn't really live up to that. He wasn't really suited for that role. He didn't have the same fragging output, the same kind of impact on big games, especially international games outside of NA borders. Famously, in fact, throughout most of his time in that lineup, that core, he just wasn't that good against international teams except when he was in NA, because even his famous monster series against Virtus Pro at ESEA Season 16 was obviously in NA border. It wasn't in Europe, it wasn't at a major, and so he never really had those big star performances outside of the NA border. So he couldn't really play up to that role, so it actually fell to Swag to take that role over and to become arguably the best NA player at the time, but right up there with Hiko, both very good players, and n0thing was left kind of in the 3rd role, and he was doing okay at that role. He was decent enough. Then, when Shroud left, when Swag left, in came Shroud, and so Shroud kind of then had the expectation that since Nothing's not going to be a second star and a star, we need Shroud to be. Shroud initially was doing it for like the first 2 lands. He has someone Cologne, he has Face It Season 2. After that, he couldn't really manage it. He fell off. He had his issues against the international teams. And so this is where you start to see the Cloud9 lineup struggle for firepower. And then even Hiko had a slump right at the end of the year. And suddenly, they really lacked for any kind of star power at all. That's why they weren't making the playoffs of any of these European tournaments in that last stretch. So Hiko wanted to cut Nothing. He didn't like the practice ethic from the guy, where famously, even if he turned up to practice, he'd have difficulty remembering things, and he'd just want to do his own thing, and he wouldn't want to run the strats necessarily, and he wouldn't remember the strats, he wouldn't remember the details of the strats, or what he was supposed to do, or listen to the strat caller in terms of when he was supposed to buy the flashes, or when he's supposed to buy a gun, or when he's supposed to fully save. Wasn't always on board with that sort of thing and buying into the system. And more importantly, he also never really wanted to play the roles that seemed to best suit his skill set and for what the team needed at the time. So throughout his time in CSGO, he's largely been fighting against ever playing an aggressive entry role for his team, despite the fact that's when he seems to be at his best. When he runs in, goes through a smoke, jumps in, uses his pretty good aim to lock onto a guy, start doing shots, start causing damage, and then allow someone like whoever it might be, a Hiko, a Swag, to come in behind him, trade, get the kills, or maybe they just open the site and then Sean Gares' tactics work. He's always fought against that, and he's always wanted to be more the lurker, more of the back end of the attack. And the problem here is, this isn't something that's just dedicated to CSGO. This was his problem in Evil Geniuses when Lurpus was playing with him, is that he was this fantastically talented player, and they tried to get him to be more aggressive, try to get him more things, but he always wanted to be this complete player and play more at the back end of the game and show his smarts by winning a 1v1 or 1v2. And he was decent at that. Against NA competition, he was good, but against the international teams, he was never quite as good as the other players who play that role, and so this was a problem. And his teams in CSGO lacked for that aggression. So that's one of the problems. And primarily it's a problem in CSGO because in 1.6 he's much more talented relative to the game in the international level of competition. So you could afford him more space and give him more leeway and make him more happy in that sense. In CSGO he needed to be more of a role player and do the things that the team needed. It's also a problem because when Shazam came into the team and Hiko had left, now they lacked even more for an impact player, even more for a clutch player, even more for someone who's good against international competition, because Shazam played very poorly in Cloud9 and suffered in pretty much every game except the nuke game that they had against NIP which was the upset, at MLG Aspen. Had really hard time in the team. And so at this point in time, there was only really Shroud you could look at and go was a potential star. And even he was having crisis of confidence, reduced impact on the game. At this point in time, Sean Gares was really frustrated. I mean, he'd already been frustrated the previous year and given up leadership to Semphis previously, seeing if that would work. That hadn't worked. At this point in time, it's like all the effort he was putting in looking at demos, trying to design struts, people weren't running them, people weren't communicating, people were doing stupid things, dying in a pathetic way. And I could understand why you'd be frustrated and be like, what the fuck am I wasting my time for here? This team isn't working for me. But then they made the move. They kicked out Shazam and Semphis. Semphis had been the kind of guy who was a bit short-circuiting some of Sean Gares' things, which might be frustrating. Shazam just wasn't performing. So they brought in Skadoodle and Freakazoid. And this was obviously a great roster move because Skadoodle was already an extremely good player and proved himself to be a legit star player consistently for the team. Freakazoid joining activated Shroud to come up to a star level performance for those first few months, and Freakazoid joining made Sean Gares' approach so much more efficient and effective, and as a result made him a lot happier and felt like he was having an impact on the game, and not all the time he put into studying teams could actually help them win maps and games, and it did. That's why they got to 3 finals. So in this particular team, Nothing fit in a lot better. Now the problem is, now with Sean Gares gone, we don't have any of that stuff of the tactical aspect and all that sort of thing, and that was fading anyway. And Shroud's having his issues now. Even though Freak still plays his role just as well, Shroud isn't quite as good. He's good against NA competition. He has the odd map against the international competition now. Skadoodle's still a pretty legit star. People say he doesn't practice as much, but his level seems to have dropped off a bit. He is still pretty consistent overall. And famously, he's never really blown it out at the majors. He's never had his star performances at the majors. So there's a problem there. So almost everything in the team, except Freakazoid basically, is kind of got a lot of question marks, a lot of uncertainty around it. So now where are we? Well, now N0thing is not only changing his role, he's becoming the in-game leader. So he has to now understand the game tactically. He has to read the game. On top of that, he has to help decide which roles are beneficial for other people. And he has to bring in this new guy, Stewie2K, who essentially has no real competitive history, and Teach him how to play against international competition. Teach him what role he should do and how to do it and how to fit into n0thing's system. So you'd imagine at the moment it's going to be a fairly open system because this isn't someone who had a great brain for the tactical aspects of the game. He's good in 1v1s and 1v2s. He did get quite good at that in that last Skadoodle Shroud team and Freakazoid, but not necessarily in terms of the tactical side of the game. He's actually someone who famously is being a bit of a scatterbrain in that sense. So this new role that he finds himself in as the last member of that lineup is, it's up to him. He's either going to write an entirely new chapter of his career and we'll say, remember the days before n0thing was an in-game leader and how he transitioned into that, and maybe he retained some of the aspects of his role. Maybe he's like a mild happy, a watered down poor man's happy, or maybe he becomes just less of a fragger and now he has to be the pure in-game leader and other people like Stu2K have to take up the slack, whatever it might be. Maybe he can know things about Shroud and Skadoodle of how to put them in more comfortable positions. I don't know. Seems unlikely though. So either he writes that amazing new chapter and we give him a lot of props for it because it's so unlikely, or he starts to fade out both as an individual player, has less and less impact on the game, and his team, without a proper in-game leader, those massive strengths, starts to lose relevance. Because that's the problem. For Cloud9, this is a big deal as well. Cloud9 essentially lost all the talent and all the key pieces of that original lineup. Okay, Swag, we can't blame that because it was a personal reason and he left. It's supposedly to do with Hiko. So, okay, Swag leaving, I don't blame them for that. But they've lost Hiko, who at the time was the most consistent player, fit his role the best out of everyone in the team at the time, and had the best history of performing domestically and internationally against the top-level teams, and was really suited to the team and seemed to get along with people like Sean Gers, Semphis, had quite a good balance in the team. They lost him in exchange for keeping n0thing. That was the choice they basically made by refusing to cut n0thing. Then they've lost Sean Gers now. Now they're in a position where he's decided to leave the team, except he hasn't decided to leave the team and retire. That would be one thing. Then it would just be his decision. He's left the team, and now he's gone away and said, I still want to play CS, and he wants to be an in-game leader still, come back in another team, totally different team, a team with a worse lineup that most likely won't even accomplish as much. That says something about what's going on here. Now you've lost one of the best in-game leaders in North America. All of this to keep n0thing. Refusing to cut n0thing. Admittedly, some of the players within this equation also sometimes voted against cutting him. Even if they had like a 2-2, there would always be that third split decision who'd vote, no, we'll cut him, we'll keep him. Well, obviously, actually, it doesn't make sense to say 2-2 because he'd be the third one. I guess 2-2, there'd be like 1-1, and then eventually they'd get the ones to side with them. Or the org would make the final decision. So it's on Cloud9 as well now, because they've essentially gambled by letting all this other talent go, all these other key pieces go, that n0thing is the guy to build around. And yes, he's a great streaming presence. He will always be one of the best guys on camera. He'll always be a very likable guy and someone who has explosive games every now and then. But he's not a superstar talent. He's not a superstar in-game leader. He's not someone with a great history of performing internationally against European competition in Europe at majors. And so you've gambled a lot to keep this team built around this guy. And so if the team fails, some of it has to be on Cloud9 as well for not making the tough, sometimes maybe the right decisions in terms of how they did things differently. So I think they're in a very interesting place, both n0thing himself and Cloud9 as an organization. And at the moment, I have to say I'm quite skeptical about the future. I don't think there's that much good to be seen in the future. If they prove me wrong, I'll obviously be very excited to find out how and really get into that and see what happens there. But at the moment, I don't think it's going to go well. I think things are going to go downhill, actually. I don't think they'll ever reach the zenith they did with the 3 finals in the summer.